Greetings everyone, and thanks for joining us on this paranormal pit stop. Tonight, we'll be adventuring through a 2.5 acre historic graveyard located between Eugene and Junction City in Oregon that's renowned as one of the earliest burying grounds in the whole of the Willamette Valley. Also recognized under the monikers of Baker or Irving, and purported to harbor a wealth of spine-tingling paranormal activity. Are you prepared to brave the history and hauntings of Luper Pioneer Cemetery? Historically, through the 1850s, a handful of wagon trains comprised of over 50 families and several hundred individuals total would arrive to the area, with most of their travelers settling into the southern Willamette Valley. And astonishingly, many of the names featured in Luper Cemetery records date back to these very same families. Land now holding Luper was initially settled by Thomas and Elizabeth Baker, and when Thomas passed away on site, he would be the first to be buried on future Luper grounds. While Elizabeth would continue to reside on site until 1859, she would eventually remarry one Joseph Danforth, who would donate the old property for the establishment of a formal graveyard. In 1870, James Luper would purchase land encompassing the cemetery, after which it would be dubbed as Luper's Cemetery, and subsequently, Luper would construct a warehouse and railroad spur that, over time, would become a primary shipping depot for wheat. Over the years, ownership of cemetery grounds would be passed through a number of parties, including through the Bond, Jennings, and Simmons families. Through the 1960s, burials on site would largely cease, aside from those on pre-existing family plots, and while restoration and maintenance work was performed through the 1980s and 90s by the families of those interred and also by concerned community members, eventually the old cemetery was left all but abandoned to stand the tests of time, weather, and sadly, vandalism. In 2009, one Sharon Olson would be informed by locals of the sad and overgrown state of the old Pioneer Cemetery, and after rallying a group of volunteers would set to work clearing the vegetation from grave sites, after which, in September of the same year, Olson and her army would apply for a grant under the Oregon Commission of Historic Cemeteries in order to continue restorations and preservation of the expanse. Sadly, just a month later, in October, a group of gutless vandals would break onto cemetery grounds and would desecrate around 70 grave sites, knocking markers over, burning wooden crosses, and stealing other stones entirely. Thankfully, shortly after this setback, Sharon Olson and her crew would be granted the money they'd requested for repairs. The vandals would be caught and forced to pay restitution, and in 2010, the Luper Board was formed to better manage and watch over the grounds. From the time of the grant and onward, work to restore the cemetery and compile information on those interred within has been ongoing. Luper Pioneer Cemetery remains open into the present from dawn until dusk, and is accessible by way of half-mile gravel road, which departs from West Beacon Drive. Not surprisingly, into more recent times, local legends and first-hand accounts tell of supernatural activity within Luper that's suspectedly tied namely to its many plots that have faced desecration, with both staff and those visiting the yard reporting ghostly forms and white silhouettes captured in photography and video, and instances of batteries dying at abnormal rates, or of well-maintained vehicles that refuse to start after sundown. In total, the expanse holds more than 170 graves, only a portion of which are still legible. 17 interments belong to those involved in an 1853 lost wagon train, and a number of plots are occupied by the remains of names and families responsible for shaping Oregon as a whole, and those who have braved Luper's bounds have reported encounters with a range of spectral figures in clothing spanning its many years of operation, some wandering about confusedly, others seemingly keeping an eye over their final resting places, and possibly readying themselves for potential future vandals. Several informal investigations of the yard have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and frequent electronic malfunctions with gear and equipment, while other accounts detail strange gusts of wind that pick up out of nowhere, disembodied voices and footsteps heard from empty spaces, extreme hot and cold spots, and instances of tiny handprints appearing on dusty vehicles, or in which graveyard goers describe feeling small hands gripping at their arms and clothing. unsettling. Several working recent restorations have told of the feeling as if they're always under watch, or as if the eyes of all those buried around them are constantly focused, while a handful of rather intriguing anecdotes tell of adventurers who have gone to the expanse in search of an ancestor's grave, only to run headfirst into the spirits of said ancestors themselves. Lastly, as most of us are already aware, the frontier was a harsh and dangerous place, full of countless perils, and tragically, countless children were lost all too soon to illness, accidents, or even simple injuries. A range of graves at Luper belonged to both children and infants, some of whom were all of weeks old when they'd passed, and to date, many who have traipsed its grounds have told of the phantom sounds of a baby or of multiple babies heard crying from somewhere out of sight, of the disembodied pitter-patter of little feet around markers that seemingly circle lone walkers, and of encounters with the actual small spirits of said children, whose pale forms are usually sighted darting from headstone to headstone, while risking peeks at the living from cover. Thanks for tuning in for this Paranormal Pit Stop. If you enjoyed our histories and ghost stories, subscribe to our channel, like this upload, and share us with anyone you feel could use a good scare. We'll catch you next time.